right, everybody, welcome back to another Thursday episode here at the Buffalo Happy Hour with our friends. I'll let him introduce himself because he's way more qualified than I am. But we'll also talk about where we are, and then we'll dive into today's episode content, the meat and potatoes. So you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Justin Hartman. I am co-founder, co-owner, and head distiller here at Hartman's Distillery.
So where are we specifically now?
We are in the distilling floor of Hartman's Distilling Co. at 55 Chicago Street.
Fantastic. So what we want to educate our audience on are the main steps on how to distill. Derek and I had this great idea to do it, and then we're like, you know what, why don't we just have a head distiller do it? Because, again, more qualified. So here we are, tapped into our network, and we're excited for it. So first step of making whiskey, what do we got?
You got to buy the grain, or source the grain. A mash bill is made up of the grain components that go into whatever your product might be. For a bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn. We do two different bourbon mash bills here, and then we blend them at the end. First one being one that's 21% rye, 76% corn, and 4% malted barley. The second large grain in that is called the flavor grain. Corn has to be at least 51%. Don't get me wrong, you get a lot of flavor from the corn. That's what gives bourbon that bold, sweet taste that we all know and love.
Yep.
But it's that second main grain that distinguishes between whether it's a little more spicy and hearty like a rye or a little bit softer and sweeter like a wheat.
Sure.
Our second mash bill is 45, well, it was 45%. We actually just reduced it to 35% wheat. We still go with the 5% malted barley. We actually use a honey malt here on both ends of it. And what would it be? The other would be 55% corn.
Love it.
Yeah.
So there's still some math involved, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm doing it on the fly.
Yeah,
you caught me off guard.
I know. I apologize. My fault.
So this is some of our grain. This is actually the honey malt we use. So the purpose of malt is primarily to act as an enzyme to help break down those starch molecules. However, it does impart some flavor. We decided to go with an untraditional way about it, and we went with a honey malt. We switched all our malt over to honey malt. It's just the way of germination, the way they cut it off on the stage. It actually produces like a honey taste, and if you want to smell it, like a honey flavor, a honey scent to it. Yeah. We actually got this idea from Rabbit Hole, to be honest with you. They do it in all their bourbons. We tried some of their, I think it was like their 2-year make, and I believe you could pick it up, and I thought it was super cool. So we located it. It's the only one of our grains that we use that is not grown in New York State. They just started, there was a producer in New York State that just started doing it, but that's a pretty new thing here. So from the mash, it goes into what's called a mash tun, or a giant cooker, essentially. So you're putting over 1,000 pounds of grain in there. We're just over 1,000. We used to use 1,000 and made the math nice and easy, but we learned we could just get a little bit more out and fill the barrels a little fuller by adding about 20%. So you add about 500 pounds or gallons of water. It cooks for 2-3 hours, and then we have to crash it down in temperature, which is what you guys hear in the background right now, and then it gets pumped over to the fermenters.
Which is step 2.
Step 2 of the process.
Step 2 is fermentation.
Yes.
Perfect.
Very important process is step 1, though, is adding enzymes. Enzymes help the starch molecules that's found in your corn, your rye, your wheat, your malted barley, or your honey malt in our case. You want to break those starch molecules down, so eventually when you throw in the yeast can go around and eat all those starch molecules.
Perfect, because it opens it up, gives them something to eat.
Correct. Exactly.
Perfect. So once we get into step 2, how do you physically move it from point A to point B?
So we use a big old pump, commercial grade pump. It's a slurry, so it's heavy, it's thick. In fact, the one we're doing right now is our rye whiskey mash bill, so it's 95% rye, 5% honey malt. And the 95% rye is just a very thicker, hearty grain, so it's like cement. So that's why usually it takes us about 10 minutes. The rye takes us closer to 30 minutes to move. It's just that much thicker.
So it adds about 20 minutes just to move it from point A.
Just to move it, just to heat it up. That's why we do it in the wintertime when it's nice and cold.
Perfect.
Helps us cool it down faster. So every week when we do our 4 mashes, we bring over all of our grains from our warehouse, and we get ready. And each day we do a mash. Some days we do 2 mashes. Mashes are done here in the mash tun. Mash tun is a 700-gallon vessel. We fill it with 500 gallons worth of water. The grains go in just right out of the bags, right like you saw, based on a certain weight percentage. And yeah, it's heated up, and eventually, you get up to boiling or right at about 212 degrees. You pitch two different yeasts, you pitch two different enzymes on the way up and on the way down. And when it comes down, we actually want to crash it, which means we want to chill it faster than it's going to do naturally on its own. And to do that, we use a tube-in-tube wort chiller. So basically, it's just a heat extraction device where you're pumping the wort through. Cold water's running around the outside. The cold water's absorbing the heat, and the wort's coming back into the tank a lot colder than it came into the wort chiller. So we crash that down, and once it's of temp, we use the big old pump, which is what we're doing right now, to pump the mash from the mash tun to whatever fermenter we're filling. This one, we appear to be filling up Elliott here, named after Brent Elliott, master distiller over at Four Roses.
So similar to beer, cleaning is a massive aspect of this too.
Oh yeah.
Do you immediately clean once you're done pumping from point A to point B, or do you wait until the end?
No, I mean, everything gets cleaned as soon as it's done being used.
Okay.
Yeah, the mash tun gets cleaned. There's still some water on the floor because we were just power washing inside of the still. It's just a process. You want to stay ahead of it. You know, I mean, there's a little bit more of a sanitation factor in distilling only because you're ultimately heating it up and using just the vapors. But at the same time, little variances such as, all right, let me go into the weeds just a little bit. Is that all right?
That's okay.
All right.
No problem.
So ultimately what you're doing, you're pitching yeast in your mash, right? And you want your distiller's yeast, which we have a certain yeast strain that we use, to go around and eat the starch molecules and release certain compounds that are eventually going to make up your whiskey's profile. Believe it or not, there's natural yeast everywhere in the year. In addition to that, you know, a tank, it's metal, bacteria can grow, things like that. So if you're not clean, when you pitch your yeast, it's onto the mash, and you already have the natural yeast, it's going to be a competition for who gets to eat the starch molecules first and produce your flavored first. So kind of the way sour beer is made, they kind of intentionally sour it, you're trying to avoid that. You want your nice, healthy yeast in there, eating up as much of the mash as you can. And that has everything to do with cleanliness, has everything to do with temperature. That's why you want to hit a certain temperature point when you're right before you pitch the yeast. That's why you want to keep it in the temperature range. Because if it gets too high, the yeast die. If it gets too low, the yeast falls asleep. And then it gives that natural yeast more opportunity, or that bacteria, whatever, to negatively impact your mash. So cleanliness is a huge part of it.
So when you were first starting, we won't ask how many tons of fluids were wasted, but you figured it out. You got your ranges.
Sure.
We'll keep that secret for you. Everything's a great success. We move it over to the fermentation tanks, and then you want to just talk about step 2.
Step 2 is, so we move it over to the fermentation tanks. We got cooling jackets on the fermentation tanks. And again, we just want to keep that mash in a nice range.
Okay.
We go and we pitch the yeast. We repopulate the yeast, and it's essentially just waking up. They come in dry pack containers. We wake them up, we pitch it in there, we give it a good stir, and we let the yeast do their thing. And the yeast are going to go around, eat the starch molecules, and produce 3 things: heat, CO2, and alcohol.
Okay.
We're, at the end of 2 or 3 days, when the yeasts are all done, we're going to be sitting at about a 10% ABV. And you can tell when it happens, because once that yeast gets going, all the heavy grain molecules actually move to the top and start bubbling. It's really cool. And you get a head on that, especially on ours. Every container is a little different, but we'll get a 5-inch head on that, to the point where we have to crack through with the paddle that we use to give it a good stir. However, after about 3 days, all of a sudden that head falls and it stops bubbling. You're done. The yeast is done its course, ran its course. It could be up to 4 days. Everything's the kind of temperature, weather dependent, stuff like that. But then you got your what's called wort or beer, and it should be sitting at about anywhere from 9.5 to 10% ABV. So we have 4 fermenters here. Each one is 550 gallons. So it's where the mash will stay, and we'll put the yeast in the top. If we didn't pitch the second enzyme in there, this is where we'll pitch the second enzyme. Again, just to break down those starch molecules. We'll put the yeast in, and then if you can see here on either side, it has cold water jackets, essentially just to make sure that mash stays at a certain temperature, giving our yeast the prime opportunity to eat up all those starch molecules, produce as much beautiful alcohol and esters as it possibly can, create a nice whiskey mash for us. So when the mash is done, when it's kicked, we hook the pump back up. and now we're going to pump directly back into the still.
Love it.
Yeah.
So then we got to go to step 3.
Right.
And step 3 is?
Step 3 is the first distillation. We do a double distillation method here. The first distillation is simply solid separation. We're just trying to get the alcohol out and out of the wort, the big slurry wort that we have. So we pump that wort back over into the still. We hit it with steam, and the whole principle is that alcohol boils at a lower boiling point than water. So the first thing to come off is alcohol. So it comes off, it gets kind of pressurized through the system to a condenser. A condenser is nothing more than a tube of cold water. Once that hot steam hits that cold water, it turns back into liquid form, drops. And that's when it does it at such a fast enough rate that you're collecting a clear liquid at about 30% ABV, and we'll collect it for about 2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah.
Have you tasted that? Or do you just kind of leave it alone?
You don't want to taste it.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
It's not just like alcohol. When I say alcohol, this first run is not alcohol like you think, like you drink. There's many different forms of alcohol, including acetone and things that aren't too good for you. So you collect all the alcohols in the first run. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't smell that pretty. It doesn't necessarily. I've never tasted it. I never wanted to. So that's what we call our low wines at that point. Okay. It's a clear liquid. It's at about 30% ABV.
Perfect. So is this where the hand sanitizer aspect kicked in with the distillation process, or is that later? Outside question.
Yeah, that's a different animal. Then you have to distill it down to get all the way up to that 192 proof to make that hand sanitizer. But to go back to what you were saying, I think you're referring to is some of that hand sanitizer wasn't smelling the best.
Yes.
Because in their second distillation run, they weren't taking out the heads. Because they're like, it's just going out people's hands. It's not necessarily being ingested. So the heads and the tails are left in. Doesn't smell the greatest.
Gotcha.
It's not pure ethanol. That's why they also put on it, don't drink it.
Yes.
This is a 660 gallon hybrid pot still. One of the largest in the state of New York. So we'll pump all 530 gallons over to the still. It's steam heated. So that's what these pipes are here. It comes from our boiler room, across the top of the distillery floor, down. Well, there's a simple little control valve over here with a pressure gauge. So we pump it in, seal it up, hit it with the steam. And again, that first run, we're just going hot and fast because it's just solid separation. We just want to get the alcohol out, let's go, let's collect it, and let's move on kind of thing.
Moving on to the fourth phase is?
Well, actually, there's phase, I guess,
3B.
3B.
We could go 3B before we actually get into aging.
So 3B is we collect all of the low wines. So each fermenter here yields about 1 barrel of bourbon in the very end.
Okay.
Roughly, they yield about 150 gallons of low wines, or 200 gallons of low wines. We put them all together back in a still at the end of the week, and we do what's called a second run, or a distillation run. Now, this run is, again, run through the still, steam on it, but it's a lot slower. It's a lot more directed. There's a lot of different temperature gauges that you'll see involved. Mm-hmm. And we run it through a second column this time that has copper plates, because the more copper a distillate hits, the better, essentially, because copper combines with the sulfur that's just naturally in there to make copper sulfate. It drops out of your final product. So we customized our still to make sure the entire thing was copper. We had a second column with all copper bubble trap caps that you'll see that the vapors actually pass through. So that's actually closer to 7.5 hour, 8 hour run. And that's fun because essentially this is where you collect your ethanol and you make your heads and your hearts and your tails cuts.
Yep.
Think of it as like a bell curve. You want to collect that middle 70%.
Okay.
That first 15% is alcohols you don't want, such as acetone. That last 15% is alcohols that you don't necessarily want, like butanol, or there's a whole bunch in there, but they're not terribly bad either. There's a whole other set of science, we got really in the weeds some of the time, where people actually aim for a little bit of tails, because they're starting to map out, like it adds banana if it's aged for this long under these certain conditions. There's a little bit more to the tails, but generally people take out the heads and the tails. They want that 70%, they want that ethanol. That's what comes off the still. It's still clear, but now it's coming off anywhere between like 152 all the way down to about 120. Our middle of the line, or our final collection, the aggregate, is proofed out at about 140. So for that first run, that stripping run, The condensate's going to come across the top here and go straight into the condenser. And the condenser is the big column with a bunch of little tubes going forth, coming out with cold city water. It's going to hit that cold city water, condense, and bubble over, and we're going to collect it right out of here. And it actually comes down at such a high rate that this little upside down straw here is bubbling over with distillate. This is where we'll take the cap off and we can do our distillation measurements. We let a hydrometer sit right here and it tells us the proof at all times, and we measure the proof. This helps us make our cuts. This helps us read what kind of alcohols are coming in and out. The middle column here is actually what we activate for that final stripping run, or final spirits run, I'm sorry. So then the condensate actually gets pushed down, up through here, and out to the condenser. And this just allows it to hit a bunch more copper. There's also a deflator at the top, a copper deflator at the top. If we wanted to, we could turn all these different plates on, the bubble copper trays, and each one would count as a different distillation cycle. So for example, if you ever heard 6 times distilled vodka, it doesn't necessarily mean that the vodka ran through a still like this 6 times. It means there was 6 distillations, which could have just been 6 plates. Sometimes you hear 20 times distilled vodka, that means there's 20 plates involved. Sometimes there's the deflator involved or not. Deflator is similar to a condenser, only it's all copper, and it's like that final cleansing. So we actually, believe it or not, we don't activate the deflator, we don't activate any of the plates when we're doing our whiskey runs. We found out that it was actually bumping up our proof a little too high. Whiskey cannot come out of the still over 160 proof. We still like the fact that it's hitting all that copper. We think that adds to the making sure that all the sulfur's out of the distillate. So we just let it pass through kind of naturally without actually trying to physically distill it more times. Because whiskey, you want more of that flavor grain. You want a little bit of grit to it. That's why on the whiskey still, you'll see that nice smooth helmet, or whiskey stills will have a kind of a smooth helmet or like a Hershey Kiss size shape to them. You want that gentle distillation. You don't necessarily want a harder, heavier distillation because you're not trying to clean it as much. You're not trying to create a neutral spirit like a vodka or a gin. The heads and tails are the first 15% and last 15% of the run, and those are rough numbers. Alcohol is not all just ethanol, but you want to collect just the ethanol. The ethanol is that middle, probably 70% of the curve, which means that you want to get rid of the first 15%, collect the next 70, and then get rid of or reuse the last 15%. So to make those cuts, we'll rely heavily on the various thermometers. So we've recorded what kind of happens in our still. Every still is different, at different temperature points, what different readings mean. And then we'll rely heavily on the hydrometer, what the proof is based on the different temperatures. And then ultimately also comes down to simple smell, touch, taste. The aroma of it, it's very obvious when it goes from acetone to ethanol. And then at the very end, it's very obvious when it's coming out of ethanol and more into this wetter, tailsier type alcohol.
And then that leads us into our final step.
Leads us into the final step. Final step is you proof it down and you put it in the barrel. Bourbon, by definition, cannot be proofed or put in the barrel at an entry proof above 125. So you proof it down with reverse osmosis water. It's essentially water that's just filtered to mimic the reverse osmosis process. Flat, clear, nothing in it.
Yep.
We proof it down. We proof ours down to 2 different levels. We proof our wheat down to 107, our wheated bourbon. We proof our rye down to 117. Rye and wheat are very different. That's what our whole thing is, but combining them at the very end. That's why we distill them differently, proof them differently, different proof entry points, and it does make a difference. And you sock them away. You fill the barrels with about 52 gallons and sock them away.
And how long are you aging?
Right now, we're trying to hit the 4-year mark before the HDC, the stuff that we made right here in this room, hits the market. Yes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. We use brand new white oak American barrels, char 3, and we alternate between a char 3 and we have some char 2s, and then all of them are heavy toast. So there's a char and a toast on all of our barrels here. We use Kelvin, or this is actually Spice Head Cooperage, so this is one of the MGPs. But we use only Independent Stave, and we did have a small order from Kelvin to try them out. Independent Stave Cooperage is out of Lebanon, Kentucky. Massive cooperage, one of the largest in the world. Tough to get a contract with. They make some of the best barrels. That's why we're happy with where our barrels are. So in essence, what happens here is 50 to 70% of the flavor comes out of these little bad boys. When the distillate comes off, it's clear. It's clear, it tastes like corn, whiskey, moonshine. It goes into these, it ages, that's where you're gonna get all that nice caramel color, all those toffee, vanilla, caramel, some cherry, different flavor profiles based on its aging in the barrel. That's why having a good barrel is really key to making good whiskey. So what you're looking at here is actually the head of a barrel. It is a charred head of a barrel, and you can see the char on top of it. You can also see, if you look real close, the line of where the whiskey actually penetrated into the wood. It's maybe even better right here. Kind of see where that dark wood goes to that light wood. And right behind that light dark wood, or actually, I'm sorry, right behind the char, if you look real close, there's what's called the red layer, and that formally is what was where the char turns into more of a toast, and it's more of a caramelization. Those red layers are a lot more prominent in toasted barrels that include a toast.
Thank you so much. We appreciate all your knowledge. We're extremely fortunate to have you in our city, but then also have the ability to come down here and work with you and do these kind of videos that really help our audience. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely, no problem.